Hi, everyone. So we're all alive I think in a very exciting time, historically speaking. We're all present to see the fastest adoption of technology in human history, which is really quite an astonishing feat. And so we're really living in what I like to think of as a mobile world. If you don't own a mobile phone, a smartphone or a flip phone, raise your hand. Right. So if I were to ask that question 10, 15, 20 years ago, the landscape would be completely different, right? And so when I say the fastest adoption of technology in human history, let's put some numbers behind that. This is the UN's telecommunication estimates for the penetration of mobile cellular subscriptions worldwide. And if at the end of 2001 we were looking at approximately 1 billion subscriptions, the estimate is that towards the end of 2017 there will be over 7 billion. Now, that of course doesn't mean that every single person on the planet has a mobile phone. Companies have more than one contract. Some individuals have more than one device. But what it does mean is that by and large, the vast majority of the adult population on the planet has access to a mobile phone. Now, to contextualize this a little bit more, think of the healthcare implications that are linked to the fact that there are more people on the planet that have a mobile phone than they do to a working toilet, or a toothbrush, or consistent electricity. And that your smartphones, most of you probably own smartphones, your contemporary smartphone has by far greater computational capacity than NASA had when they sent the Apollo missions to the moon. And that's sitting in your pocket. And so this, of course, creates tremendous potential for healthcare. For the first time ever, we're able to reach people in real time and in real place in locations where there may not be any physical infrastructure at all. And we give them devices and the opportunity to reach us or reach resources in real time or close to real time in a way that just was not imaginable a few years earlier. And so I'm a clinical psychologist with an interest in people with serious mental illness, people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and severe and debilitating depression, the kind of folks that usually get services at community mental health centers here in the US and public sector type of interventions around the world. These are often the folks who are marginalized, who have limited access to resources. Before I could allow myself to imagine thinking about interventions for this group, I first needed to see whether the numbers that apply to the general population, does the same penetration of mobile phones apply to people with schizophrenia and other debilitating psychiatric illnesses with everything that we know. And so back in 2011 and 2012, and I say back in 2011, in the mobile health space, this is a lifetime ago, right? With the evolution of technology and what we've seen with mobile carriers and devices, this is considered a long, long time ago. We conducted a large survey with close to 1,600 people with these diagnoses receiving services in the greater Chicago area. We just wanted to see, are you using phones? If you are, how are you using them? Are you similar to the general population, or are there some real differences here? And we found that 72% of people receiving community-based mental health services had a mobile device of some sort, a mobile phone or a texting device, a sidekick that allowed bidirectional texting for people with hearing impairment, and some already owned smartphones. And in terms of how they paid for it, well, a lot of people, about a third of them, reported having a monthly plan. Others were using what they called government minutes or Obama phones. What this really refers to is the Federal Lifeline Assistance Program. It's below a certain income level, you're eligible in the US to have access to a mobile device, and depending on the state that you live in, anywhere between 200 to unlimited call and text minutes. And so people were using this resource to get these devices, to get phones. In terms of how they use them, well, it was very similar to the general population. Most of them used their mobile device to talk, people were texting, and about a third of them were already using internet and email, which suggested that they had smartphones or mobile phones that had computational capacities and the ability to host apps. And so subsequent research that was conducted in other urban areas in Baltimore and Boston shows that just like the penetration increases in the general population, Same applies for people with serious mental illness. The range is anywhere between 86 to 97% of folks getting outpatient care in community settings have a mobile phone of some sort. Research conducted recently in India shows that 72 to 92% of people with schizophrenia in India have access to a mobile phone. Studies looking at 4 separate US regions showed that about 2/3 already own smartphones. And in a study that we recently completed, trying to recruit people who hear voices through Facebook, and keep in mind this is a somewhat narrower self-selecting group, right? These are people who already are on Facebook in order for us to recruit them, so probably a younger crowd that's more technologically savvy. But among those folks, 92% of people who hear voices who responded to our recruitment ads owned a smartphone. So to answer that first question, yeah, people with serious mental illness absolutely have access to mobile devices. They use them in a manner that is not all that different from the general population. And as the penetration rates of the general population increase, so does the use of mobile phones among people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And that creates the opportunity, right? So now we know that people have this conduit, this technology sitting in their pocket, and we can reach them, and they can reach us, or they can reach resources. And so for the last decade or so, that is everything that I've been doing. I've really kind of focused in on this area of mobile health, or mHealth, which means leveraging mobile technologies to support healthcare, specifically focusing on mental health with people with serious mental illness. And so my team and I have really tried to attach our efforts to what we see as a natural evolution of the technology in the commercial sector, right? We're piggybacking on the fact that all of you have mobile phones and want fancier mobile phones and want better battery life, and that there are private sector partners that are filling that need. And so at the lowest level of technological sophistication, we might do something like clinical texting, right? SMS messages between a community-based case manager and patients with psychosis and co-occurring substance use out in the field. And so it's person-to-person interactions, just like what we were intending to do with these technologies. We're not creating new technologies so much as repurposing existing technologies for care. But as we go up that evolutionary ladder, once you introduce smartphones, that's where we started dabbling with developing treatment apps. And so here, these are automated treatment interactions between the patient and the device. And I say that they're overt and visible because it's very clear to the individual that we're asking questions, and based on their responses to our questions, they will get some sort of choose-your-own-adventure intervention. And I'll demonstrate all of these in a moment. But in the last few years, really what we've been thinking more and more about are leveraging sensors. So every smartphone has a host of embedded sensors: accelerometers, light sensors, camera, the microphone, GPS. All of these can be leveraged to try to identify how people are behaving in an unobtrusive manner, right? And so this is where we try to repurpose the sensors that are in the devices for invisible monitoring. We try to disappear into the background, and when we think that there's a time-sensitive, relevant opportunity to intervene, that's when we try to swoop in. And I'll demonstrate that in about 25 minutes or so. So let's go back to that first rung, the simplest way that we try to use mobile technologies to provide care. And I'll describe a treatment model that we call the mobile interventionist. The way that this works is that we'll have a community-based case manager conduct a home visit with a patient with psychosis and co-occurring substance use, a population that is known for being complicated in engagement in care. So certainly a complex and tricky group to try to get services and maintain services over time, and because their lives are very, very, very complex. And so we do a home visit, and that's where the mobile interventionist meets with the patient, describes the intervention, and in some cases trains them how to text for the first time if they've never texted before. They'll do some runs, some mock exchanges right then and there in their home, mimicking how it will look when they start intervening the next day. And once the mobile interventionist is satisfied that they got the idea, they'll leave and the intervention will start the next day. And so an intervention starts with a daily text message that goes out from the interventionist that will ask how they're doing or pick up the conversation from where they left it off the day before. And if the individual responds, they'll start a ping-ponging back and forth asynchronous conversation, typically focusing on things like symptoms and functioning, but will often drift into other directions that the patient brings up as the challenges that they're contending with. At the end of the week, the mobile interventionist will also send a summary email to their clinical team, to the people that do provide face-to-face care. And the idea there is that the access to the new information will help inform their in-person services. So imagine as a clinician, if you see someone once a week, how much will your interventions improve if you now know what is going on with that individual every single day of the week, and if problems emerge, you hear about it probably close to real time. You might hear about it as it's happening or at the end of the day, or certainly by the end of that week. So how does something like this actually look and sound? Here are some quotes from our initial trial of this. Sarah is the name of our mobile interventionist. So it'll start with a text that says, "Hi, it's Sarah. How are you feeling, Ray?" We did change the name of the patient for this, but everything else is right out of the study. "Hi, Sarah, voices talking about me." So he's referring to the auditory hallucinations that he experiences. Those are some of the treatment targets that Sarah and Ray decided during that home visit. So Sarah sees the opportunity and says, "That's stressful. You're not alone," normalizing the experience. "Lots of people hear voices." And so Ray responds, "But they're saying something bad will happen to me if I take the bus." So he's giving her a concrete, real-world event that might be triggering to his experiences, psychotic experiences. And so Sarah hones in, right? "But voices make mistakes all the time. I have a trick that can help you test the voices. You can even use it on the bus." So she wants to give him a tool that will help him right then and there rather than having to wait until that weekly or monthly session with his clinician. And so Ray responds, "Maybe. What is it?" So it's that semi-enthusiastic response from Ray. That's what we're looking for, right? That's that window of opportunity where someone is open to learning some sort of concrete skill set that they will later on actually apply while he's riding on the bus. It was a relaxation strategy. And he was texting Sarah as the line got closer and closer to the community center that he was trying to get a ride to. And then at the end of that, texted Sarah in real time, and Sarah was able to respond with positive reinforcement. And since then, Ray has been taking the bus. And so the mobile intervention not only was able to get information about an event that happens in real time and real place that is unlikely to be captured in a psychotherapy session in a clinic, and also intervene while that event is happening in real time. And so we conducted a 12-week trial with people with schizophrenia and, as I mentioned, co-occurring substance use. They were middle-aged on average, so not an especially young or technologically savvy group. 80% of them were hospitalized 6 or more times in the past for psychiatric hospitalizations. At baseline, they had moderate cognitive impairments and moderate psychotic symptoms and moderate depression, so certainly a group that was not doing well, all right? 47% of them reported experience with texting, which means that over half of them had never texted before we conducted this intervention with them. And at the end of that trial, in terms of feasibility, we had 0 dropout, meaning every single person that started the 3-month intervention completed it, which is mind-boggling with this population. And so on average, they received about 140 text messages. They responded to 87% of the messages that required a response. So not only did they not drop out from the intervention as a whole, they were very, very engaged with these conversations with Sarah. In terms of satisfaction ratings, the majority thought that it was easy to use, that they would recommend it to a friend, that it helped them have control over events in their lives. In terms of clinical outcomes, we had at least 2 cases where people reported overt suicidal ideation that were stabilized through responses from Sarah, but also informing their clinical team that it's time to have a home visit and more intensive wraparound care. And so they didn't wind up in the hospital. One patient reporting having no medications, not sleeping, and not eating over several days, a pattern that was very similar to the pattern that she had the last time that she did wind up hospitalized. She was stabilized as a result of this time-sensitive sharing of information with Sarah and the clinical team. And in terms of measures, we saw pre-post reductions in their levels of psychotic symptoms and in their depression scores. So clinically promising. But really, from my perspective, before we piloted this approach, the main question that I had was, are we even able to build a therapeutic relationship between a provider and a patient that is entirely conducted through text messaging? I mean, aside from that first meeting that they have with Sarah, they never saw her. Right? She was this entity that was hovering in the background and trying to establish a relationship, but we've never done this before, and no one had at the time. And so we didn't know, can this come close to what we have as an established relationship when someone comes to the clinic? And so we administered the Working Alliance Inventory. It's a measure that looks at the therapeutic alliance that patients and clinicians have. Items like, we agree on what is important for me to work on, I'm confident in my clinician's ability to help me, I believe my clinician likes me. So this generates an overall summary score. And we asked people to complete this measure twice. Once rating their in-person clinicians as part of their clinical team, and the other time rating their MI, their mobile interventionist, Sarah, who provided the texting intervention. And so ratings for both of them were quite high. The ratings for the mobile interventionist were significantly better. And in some cases, these are clinicians that they've been receiving care for 8 years. And so with one home visit and regular texting, we were certainly able to develop a therapeutic relationship entirely through text messaging. Interesting, huh? Okay. Up the evolutionary ladder of interventions, now we are traipsing into this area where we are creating new technology. And I'll tell you a little bit about Focus, which is a smartphone app that we developed for people initially with schizophrenia. It's since then been deployed among people with other psychiatric disorders. And luckily, this was funded through multiple grants from NIMH and CMMI and PCORI, and most recently, the VA to deploy it among veterans in Puget Sound, VA. And so we were able to have an idea and then refine it and improve it and enhance it. And as the technology evolves and our capacities to understand what really serves users in the best way, we kept adapting the system until we thought that we have a really good tool. And we started off with a client survey where we asked about 900 people with schizophrenia to give us feedback on some of the core areas that they could use some support. We also did practitioner interviews with people who provide frontline staff, the people who provide services to people with serious mental illness out in the community. But we also spoke with community mental health center leaders because we wanted to anticipate what might be the barriers downstream if we do start deploying apps like this. What do you envision as a billing problem? How might this interfere or support the services that you're already providing? So we had an eye towards implementation early on. And so I assembled a multidisciplinary team, a health economist, programmers at Northwestern University. We all worked on this initial version of the technology. We started off with PDAs, if you remember those. You probably don't remember those, actually. The majority of the people, unless you're doing EMA research, you probably don't know what a PDA is. It's the precursor to a smartphone. It's this this microcomputer that both prompts and collects data in real time, but doesn't actually connect to doesn't transmit information, so you have to hot sync it. You have to create a landline between that and a computer. Judging by the dumbfounded faces in the audience, you have no idea what I'm talking about. But so it's that first image up there is a PDA, is a personal digital assistant. And then we had an early version of it running with texting, with a remote server. And then finally, we developed our first version of the app. And then it was enhanced and enhanced. And we also did usability testing. So we brought people with schizophrenia into the lab, had them look at the early versions, and engage in what we call a think aloud process. So they were tinkering with the device and speaking out loud what their experience was. And they were providing feedback not only on the content, like, oh, I don't understand this word, or this treatment sucks, things like that. They were also demonstrating how long it takes to find things. We were videotaping everything and timing things. And so we wanted to see how long does it take to find an icon on the screen? How quickly do they transition through screens? How large do we create the buttons? All of that was based on that lab-based usability testing and eventually a field trial. And so the way that Focus works is that it's a native application that's installed on Android phones, and it'll do two things. It'll prompt you up to 3 times a day to engage in treatment about a certain treatment area. And those treatment areas are medication use, so that can be medication adherence, reminders, or even questions about whether you're taking the right medications and how to talk to your psychiatrist about it. Voices, which means auditory hallucinations, a very common psychotic symptom. Mood, which really means depression and anxiety. Depending on what you respond, you'll get different content. Social functioning, which really means social skills training, or content focusing on paranoid ideation. Both of those can serve as barriers to social engagement. Sleep, well, that's not a core symptom of schizophrenia, but our early work, our surveys, and our interviews with people with schizophrenia showed us that time and time again, they describe sleep as a major barrier to their health. And even though it's not a core symptom, they said, when I'm not sleeping well, everything is not looking well. And sometimes sleep problems are my early indicators that things are spiraling downwards toward me. So we added a whole module devoted to sleep hygiene interventions. And so there are 3 daily prompts. People are assigned 3 content areas, but they can also access all the treatment content on demand 24/7 on the device. The way that a prompt works is that sometime during the day, it'll take over your home screen and ask you, can you check in with Focus right now? And if the individual says yes, it'll immediately launch the first assessment of the target area. Hello, Rachel. Have you been bothered by voices today? And so anything from not at all, a little, moderately, or extremely. There's a range. And here the individual decides to focus, to say that they've experienced voices and that they're moderately severe. And so now Focus hones in and starts focusing on the dysfunctional beliefs that they might have about those voices. So that is often our treatment target. We might not change the frequency of voices, but we can certainly try to intervene on the severity and impairment that's linked to them. So you can have, a lot of people have voices, but not everyone thinks that because of their voices they can't have a girlfriend or go to work or have a car or live an independent life. And that is our target. It's the impact that voices have on their day-to-day functioning. And so this individual is asked, how would you describe the voices? And these are all common dysfunctional beliefs that people with schizophrenia have. They can't be controlled, they know everything, they're powerful, they're unpleasant, or something else. And so this individual says that they know everything, and so now Focus jumps in and starts to intervene. Voices may sound like they know everything, but they don't. Can you think of any time when the voices made a mistake? So already we're trying to take them out of the moment and try to see how does this relate to past experiences of voices. How about when the voices were sure something bad was going to happen, but it didn't? If the voices got it wrong once, they probably don't know everything, right? Think about it. So a very quick and dirty evidence gathering exercise, right? How does your experience relate to something that you've had in the past, and have they ever been wrong? And usually people will have a long history of experiencing voices, but will not introspect and evaluate, what have my past experiences been like? Do I really need to listen to them right now? Do they really know everything? In addition to the patient-facing side, there's also a clinician-facing side. So there's a clinical dashboard where everything that patients endorse on the smartphone is uploaded to a secure server, summarizing everything. And so here we can see the summary of their last 7 days, the 3 treatment targets that were assigned to them, which were sleep and mood and medication, and the proportion of their responses, the percent of their responses that were anywhere from asymptomatic, response A, all the way to severe. And so a motivated clinician can scroll down through to that response log and see everything that this person has said and done from the beginning of their interaction with the treatment. Does it work, though? Right? Does it actually do some good? Well, our first stab at this was deploying focus for a 30-day trial. And once again, we recruited people with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. Average age was 46, so not an especially young crowd. On average, high school education or less, but with an 8th grade reading level. So some of the literacy characteristics that we took into consideration, we developed focus would certainly apply to this deployment. And after 30 days, we had these outcomes. First of all, patients used focus on 86% of the days that they had it. And so and keep in mind, we don't incentivize use. Once they get the device, they either use it or they don't. We'll call once a week just to make sure that they aren't experiencing technical problems and that they know how to apply the skill sets to their day-to-day life. But outside of that, there's really no additional incentive to use it more than what we prescribe. And so during that first week of those 30 days, they used it on average 6.4 times a day. During the last week, 4.9 times a day. In both cases, that's much more than the 3 prompts a day that we can calibrate here. So people elected to use it above and beyond what we prescribed. And in fact, 62% of their use was on-demand use. So creating that function that people can access at even at 2 a.m. and engage with the intervention certainly proved to be at least used by this population. So we also administered a survey examining their usability and feasibility ratings, and they were stellar. Most of them would recommend focus to a friend. They didn't find it to be very complicated. They thought that it was easy to use. If they had access to it, they would use it. It was interactive enough from their perspective. They felt confident using it. They did not need to learn a lot before they could get going with focus. It was easy to find the information that they needed. So our user-centered design really paid off with this. In terms of clinical outcomes, well, we saw significant reductions in the distress associated with their psychotic symptoms as measured by the positive and negative syndrome scale. It's a very widely used measure of psychosis. And depression. The Beck Depression Inventory showed us an average of a 6-point drop in their depression ratings. And to put this in context, at best, from in-person, face-to-face, one-on-one interventions for people with schizophrenia, we would hope to get these kinds of changes in their severity of their psychotic symptoms and depression. And usually we don't. And so we were able, in a 30-day stint using focus and those weekly calls, to get clinical outcomes that were equal or better than what we see from more time and labor-intensive clinic-based care. Since then, we've also continued to adapt focus and deployed it as part of a multi-state implementation study where people with schizophrenia who were recently discharged from a psychiatric hospitalization sometime in the last 2 months received focus and several other things, including clinic-based care, to try to prevent relapse, to try to prevent winding up back in the hospital. That 6-month period after people are discharged from the hospital is especially vulnerable for relapses. And so it really makes sense to invest a lot of time and effort to try to prevent people from winding back through that revolving door. And something interesting here came out at the end of this 3-year trial with about 340 patients. We found that the variables that usually predict engagement in clinic-based care were the same variables that predicted whether people would engage in focus or not. So females on average engaged more than males, white participants engage on average more than African American participants, older participants, older meaning 30 or older, engaged more than younger participants. And so these are exactly the same patterns that we see in terms of engagement in face-to-face psychotherapy with this population. But overall, when we look at their use of focus over time, the red line represents 44% of the sample, which are considered our ultra users, but the black line represents the overall average for the entire sample. You'll see that even though the use diminishes over the 6-month period, it never really disappears. So we have people using focus, whether it's days responding to prompts, their daily on-demand use, their days of on-demand use, or their overall use of any type of focus function. We see that it continues for most well into 6 months. So if you think of the average shelf life of an app, which is anywhere between 3 to 5 days, this was astonishing. And we were able to get people to continue to use some functions on a regular basis throughout that 6-month period. And so since that, we also developed our audio-video version of focus. And we know that a lot of people with schizophrenia often have limited education, limited literacy. And so we thought, well, if people need to read through all of this, we're really kind of missing the bus here, right? There are many opportunities to deliver content to people. We're not making full use of what smartphones can offer us, right? They can do a lot more than just plaster written material on a screen. And so we created a version of focus that has a brief video for every single one of the 190 or so interventions, sub-interventions that exist with focus. There's now a video representation of it. And so someone can elect to go down the video route, and if they do that, they might see something like this.
Voices make mistakes all the time. Try this experiment to test your voices. Ask them to make a prediction about the color of the next 3 cars that you see in the street. Write down the colors and the order that the voice is saying. Now, test it. Are the next 3 cars exactly in the same order of colors that they mentioned? If they got it wrong, think about it. What else could the voices be getting wrong? The predictions are not always right.
So not only are we leveraging the multimedia capabilities of a smartphone, but we're also trying to attach the intervention to something that they can use by looking out the window right now, to try to make it as concrete and as real time as possible, to really bring the intervention to life. And so the last leg of the focus program of research was a comparative effectiveness trial. We did a randomized control trial where we randomized 82 people to the focus arm and 81 people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression to RAP, which is a clinic-based group intervention. It's group therapy that is co-facilitated by people with lived experience of illness. And so we wanted to see, are people, is there some sort of advantage to being in the clinic with other people, something delivered by trained facilitators, or can the mHealth intervention hold up? And so to get to the end point of this, there were no significant differences in the improvement on clinical outcomes or the satisfaction ratings between the conditions. They improved in both, and they improved in practically identical ways. And so if you look at their engagement over time, though, there was a real difference. That first section talks about the number of people who actually commenced treatment after they were randomized, meaning they come into to our lab or to the clinic, and they're told that they're going to participate in one of 2 types of interventions. Then they get an envelope. Once they complete their consent form, they conduct the baseline assessment, looking at their psychopathology and other variables. They open the envelope and they learn where they've been allocated to. And so we see that of the people allocated to focus, the mHealth arm, 90% of them actually went on to use the intervention at least once, whereas only 58% of the group that was allocated to the group intervention showed up ever for any session. So we lose a big part of the audience in terms of our capacity to deliver any kind of content to them right off the bat in the clinic-based arm. And then as the study goes on, 8 weeks in, the number of people that are fully engaged in focus, meaning they're using it at least 5 days of every 7 days, 5 days a week, it's 56% in the people using focus, and only 40% of people in the RAP arm are attending every weekly session. And towards the end, the numbers diminish, right? And keep in mind, these are the people who are the sort of the perfect participant, right? Who use focus 5 days a week, every week, or attend every single session. And so there, the numbers are similar. We see that they have similar changes in their symptom checklist 9. It's a quick measure of their overall psychopathology. We see similar changes in their depression ratings. And we see similar ratings improvements in their recovery assessment scale. And so they really perform very similarly, aside from the fact that we have more engagers over time in the focus arm, and that one is much more resource intensive, right? For group therapy, you need facilitators, you need a room, you need sofas, you need oxygen, you need air conditioning, you need transportation. Satisfaction ratings, remarkably similar. So their satisfaction ratings were almost identical. So we certainly were able to perform just as well as more time and resource intensive group therapy using focus. Okay, last rung up with that evolutionary ladder of technological sophistication. Here's where things get a little fancier. This is a platform that was developed with funding from NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, through their Eureka program, which is a fancy acronym for high risk, high reward research. So sort of things that are thinking a little bit out of the box. And so we created, I collaborated with computer scientists at Dartmouth and at Cornell to create a platform that has multiple functions. There's self-report, like you saw in Focus, where people will get questions and they will respond. But our platform also collects their information about app use and the traffic of calls and text messages. So we don't actually look at the content of apps or their online activity. We just look at the frequency and duration. We don't look at the content of their text messages. We just see how much is going in and how much is going out. But we also look at the sensors. So we capture GPS, which you use to navigate. We repurpose that to determine their geolocation. And I'll explain what geolocation means to us in a moment. We look at their light sensor. We'll spark up the microphone. We'll look at the accelerometry ratings. All this to try to identify behavioral indicators of when we think someone is not doing well or not. Now, all this is uploaded to remote secure servers, and we're hovering in the background. We're looking at the stream of information over the course of a year. We give CrossCheck, the name of the system, we give CrossCheck with phones to people with schizophrenia for a year of data collection. And so the study had 3 phases to it. In the first round, we really just needed to create a platform and test it. And it's not a trivial thing, right? So something that we do is spark up the microphone to capture ambient sound. And so we have language processing software that will help us determine whether it's detecting human speech in someone's environment or not. That's very tricky if someone's watching TV. So if they're sitting close to the TV and Charlie Rose is on, it's basically indistinguishable from being in a social environment and actually talking to someone. And so over the course of a year, we kept tweaking, and I kept kind of poking at my computer scientist colleagues to say, no, we got to get this better, we got to get this better, we got to get this better. We need to take it out into the field, we need to test it in a small apartment, in a large house, to just sort of test the boundaries until we thought we had as robust a platform as possible. And then we ran feasibility and usability trials, first with outpatients with schizophrenia in Long Island, which was our study site, to see how does this look when we deploy it out into the field, when people have different connectivity, right? When people might forget it at home. And then we also deployed it in an inpatient setting, right? We wanted to see how are people who might have severe psychopathology, in the throes of psychotic episodes, might they disengage, use it in a pattern that's different? Would they find it unacceptable? And after we demonstrated that there wasn't a problem there, we conducted a randomized control trial where 150 people were allocated either into the focus arm or treatment as usual. Typical outpatient care from Zucker Hillside Hospital in Long Island. And our objective was to increase the time to relapse, meaning the number of days between when they start until their next relapse. We wanted to extend that and reduce the number of relapses overall that they experience over the course of a year. So, like I said, our software repurposes the GPS and helps us determine the distance that they cover during the day, but also helps us determine the time that they spend at a particular location. Now, we never look up the coordinates to determine what the location is, because you could, right? We can find out what the exact address is. What we do look at is we label 3 locations, primary, secondary, and tertiary, and we look at the amount of time that they spend in each one of these. In the indoor study, when we did this on a psychiatric inpatient unit, if you're not close to a window, GPS won't work. So we outfitted the inpatient unit with little Bluetooth beacons in every single room on the inpatient unit. And so when people were completing their questionnaires, they would get pinged from the Bluetooth beacons, and depending on the strength of the beacon, the closer they were to one of them would help us determine what room exactly they were in when they responded to certain questions. And we wanted to see, was there a relationship between their immediate environment and some of their beliefs. Accelerometry helps us determine their kinesthetic activity, whether someone is walking or running or cycling, but really more than anything, the proportion of sedentary time. We know that being inactive entirely is often a strong predictor of overall functioning and certainly mental health, and we wanted to see, are you, assuming that people carry their smartphone on them, how sedentary are you? So we'll spark up the microphone every 2 minutes or so, and it captures ambient sound, even if it's sitting in your pocket or your purse. And so that helps us determine the conversation frequency around you and conversation duration. Once speech is detected, how long does that typically last in one exchange? And what we're looking for are changes over time, right? We don't necessarily approach this with some sort of expectation that a certain length of conversation is better than another length. We just say, how do you look at baseline when you're not close to a hospitalization, and how does this look when you are close to a hospitalization or some other form of relapse? We're looking for changes. And so we combined their device use, light sensor, microphone, and accelerometry, all to try to infer sleep duration. And this doesn't require you putting the smartphone in bed with you, so long as it's in the room with you. While you're asleep, we are up to about 35 minutes off of self-reported sleep. So we combine all these to try to determine how long you're sleeping every night, and of course this varies from person to person, right? Some people sleep on the sofa with the TV on in the middle of the day, and that throws off the modeling a little bit, but most people don't. So how does this actually look? I'll present 3 patient patterns over the course of a year of data collection. The blue line represents a psychiatric hospitalization, so the very thing that we're trying to prevent, and we know that they wound up in the hospital there. In this case, the black dot represents a composite score of their self-reported symptoms and functioning. The higher the dot is, closer to 15, the better they're doing. The lower it is, the more symptomatic and more functionally impaired they are. And they get asked about their symptoms and functioning every 3 days with CrossCheck. And so it starts on day 1, and then for about 50 days or so, the person is not responding to self-report questions at all, right? And so we call them and we try to encourage them to engage a little bit more, and once they realize what needs to happen here, they're back online and they respond reliably. And there's certainly some fluctuations in their functioning between day 50 and 200 or so, but they're more or less within that range of 0 to 15. So in some days they have more symptoms than others, but they're relatively stable. But look what happens at around day 230. There's a very clear drop in their composite score, showing that they are not doing well. They're endorsing a lot of symptoms, a lot of functional impairment, they're not leaving home, and they seem to have good insight to this. And that happened, and they basically dip as low as you can go, and they wind up in the hospital. And so they're there for a week or so, but once they're discharged, you can see them start to climb back up again, right? They're back in the study, and they're self-reporting, and their composite score improves. And so in this case, just the self-report aspect of CrossCheck could really, for this individual, really be useful, right? This person has good insight to illness and is an awareness of their symptoms and is open to responding in a candid, thoughtful way, so it can be helpful. But that isn't the case for this patient. And so this individual, if you look only at their self-report composite score, they're flat throughout the entire data collection period, right? There's close to no variance in that. And so either they are remarkably stable in their life, or they're just tapping through, right? They're just blasting through because they for whatever reason, don't want to answer the questions. But if we look at their sensor data, these are the hours that they represent at their primary location. And so here we certainly see changes, right? The GPS system was turned off between day 60 and about 150, so they go dark there. We're not getting any data come in. And again, we see these fluctuations in how much time they spend probably at home as their primary location throughout the day. But then right around day 210 or so, it flatlines. So they stop spending any time at all at their primary location. Now, we know that it's not that the GPS system is malfunctioning, because we are getting readings just from a different spot. And so if we just look, and they get hospitalized, right? There's a dramatic change in their housing situation, and we don't know what it is, right? We don't know whether someone is homeless, or they moved, or why they're not spending any time anymore in their old home. It might be housing, it might be a relationship breaking up. But we do know from the sensor data that there is a major change in their life just based on the passive data, and that seemed to have a very bad effect on their mental health. That puts them in the hospital for a fair amount of time. So self-report, not so useful for this individual. Passive sensing perhaps gives us something. And the last example that I use out of real patient data involves their device use between midnight and 6 a.m. So this means whether they're online or they're using apps or some indication that they are engaged with their smartphone. And again, we'll see changes, right, between day 0 and day about 130. We have some nights where they're awake between midnight and 6 a.m. for a little bit, but then something happens around day 140 or so, right until that hospitalization period, where this person is clearly awake. So their sleep patterns have been thrown off, and they have weeks of not sleeping between midnight and 6 a.m., and then they wind up in a hospital for a real good chunk of time, and they're treated, and once they're discharged, look what happens to their sleep again between midnight and 6 a.m. So again, we're not looking at the content of what they're doing online, but we know that they are definitely not asleep. So what do we think, where's all this leading with sensing? If you try to make a sense of the mess of sensor data, it's going to be very, very, very difficult. We have enormous data streams coming in on a regular basis for each individual. We don't come with some sort of a priori hypothesis of what mentally healthy will look like, right? What we're looking for are these events. What we're looking for is the very thing that we're trying to prevent. Hospitalization, suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, an emergency room visit with a psychiatric underbelly, arrest. And so when we have that, that's when our system goes through the data, and we try to look at that individual's unique combination of sensor data. So each person will have different anchors, right, on sleep, on conversation frequency and duration, on time spent at a primary location. It's that pattern that precedes that event that becomes that individual's unique relapse signature. So we're not looking for indicators that will cut across all individuals with schizophrenia. We're looking for changes within individual over time. And so as they continue to engage, now we're not just hunting blindly, right? Now we're looking for something. And when we find it, when we see a pattern that is similar to the last time that you had some trouble, that's when we're not so passive anymore, all right? That's when we raise the red flag and we become very active. And so very active means that on one side, we contact the individual directly and we give them some feedback, right? Because again, we're not the NSA. This isn't done in some sort of clandestine manner. They know that we're engaged. They know we're collecting data. They are hopefully willing partners that carry the device on them, that complete self-reports on a regular basis. They're expecting us to reach out to them when we think that there's a problem. They're looking for that. And so we will reach out and we'll provide feedback and we'll say, it's looking like a pattern that was similar to the last time that you had some problems. or patterns that we think might be problematic, and we might deploy a mobile intervention like Focus, or we might prompt them to get in touch with their clinicians at Zucker Hillside Hospital if they've been out of touch for a while. But we also reach out to their clinicians, and so could be that this person has dropped out of services, could be that this person has not been in contact for a while. We encourage them to reach out, and if ever there was a time to try to conduct a home visit or more aggressive outreach to get someone to refill that prescription or come in for a psychotherapy session, now would be a good time to do that because they seem to not be doing well. We just completed data collection for that one in July, and we're still sifting through the data. So whether it worked or not, I don't know. We'll see whether we were able to extend the time to relapse and the overall relapses throughout the year. Anecdotally, I can tell you that there wasn't a single case that when we called people and said, we think that there's something here that's looking a little screwy in the data, how are you feeling? There wasn't once where we had a misfire. That someone said, oh, there have been no changes in my life, I feel great, totally no need. Now that doesn't mean that there haven't been situations where someone was not doing well and we missed it, right? There could have been situations like that where we had false negatives like this. But for every single person that we reached out to over the phone and said, how are you feeling, Bob? They would often reply with, not great. I've been having trouble sleeping, I'm having this or that or the other, or describing some sort of life changes. And so that never hurt our rapport with them because they never felt that we were just randomly getting in touch with them, and increased their confidence that we're there looking in the background. So where is all this heading? If you think of psychopathology over the course of the lifespan, we don't intervene here, right? When people are not people yet, right? But we do know that when parents have psychopathology or substance use problems, that's risky territory for their children, right? And so mobile interventions or technology-based interventions don't usually target parents, but they can, right? We can provide resources that focus on mental health promotion in parents who are at risk, parenting e-support communities. We can start looking at people during those prodromal phases during adolescence or earlier on where people might be showing softer signs of more severe psychopathology earlier on, but try to detect some of these using social media approaches or online forums. We usually will hear about someone at the end of that first episode, right? That's usually when they come to our attention, when they show up at the clinic and they get care and they're discharged or they're in ongoing services. We can reach them much earlier than that, potentially. Usually that's where we also intervene, right? When people are doing poorly. But what about when they're feeling better? What about enhancing their recovery and relapse prevention over time? And once maybe managing their psychiatric symptoms is not so problematic, what about mobile interventions that can support things like their social functioning or their vocational rehabilitation? All those things are also linked to someone's mental health. And so there are many, many opportunities throughout the course of someone's life to intervene with any sort of psychosocial intervention, certainly with technology-based ones that in some cases might be relatively lower burden, that don't require someone showing up at a clinic, that I think can be quite useful. So this is only starting. Okay, a few quick summary words, and then we can certainly have time for questions. So as you hear all this, I want to remind you that I'm not a computer scientist or an engineer. I'm a clinical psychologist. And so I was drawn to the field of clinical psychology exactly because I believe in the healing power of human connection. I'm not looking to eliminate that from the mix. But what I found was that as I was doing ecological momentary assessment research, meaning studies where we would give mobile devices and just ask questions about how people are feeling and thinking and functioning throughout the day, a very interesting pattern emerged. When we did this with non-clinical samples, they would just return our device and get paid and be off their merry way. When we did this with people with psychopathology, they would often say things like, "Thanks, doc, this really helped me." Now, it was quite startling at the time because I was doing psychopathology research and not really interested in helping anyone. I was just trying to collect data in what I thought was an unobtrusive manner. I wanted to be the fly on the wall that's collecting data about how people experience illness throughout the day. But time and time and time again, when people returned the devices, they would say that things were helpful for them, that increased their insight, that they became more aware of what they were doing, that it sometimes helped them reflect on their relationships, much more than we ever thought was going to happen. And so from a methodological perspective, that was not great, right? That I was supposed to be hovering in the background without affecting behavior, and clearly we were affecting, at the very least, someone's subjective sense of their week. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think that if we're getting these anecdotal changes without intending to help anyone, what happens if we actually put our minds to it? What if we intentionally create mobile health interventions that are designed to change how you think and feel and function? And so that's what I've been doing ever since. And another thing to help contextualize this is that whether we want to do this as a community of psychologists, whether we're ready for this or not, whether healthcare systems are ready for this or not, is not nearly as relevant as what patients want. So patients are already using technology, and in some cases, technologies that were never intended for clinical interventions. There's very interesting literature showing that people with schizophrenia will go on YouTube and post video testimonials about illness and use the comments section as a way of creating a virtual support community. When YouTube was created, no one ever thought that people would be so creative and leverage a widely accessible tool for this particular purpose. I never thought, as a stigma researcher in a previous life, that people would want to be open and candid about their mental health conditions, but time and time again, people prove me wrong, right? And so people are voting with their feet. And the problem is that there's access to junk out there as well. There are companies that are creating mobile health apps that have zero evidence behind them. There are all kinds of potentially predatory systems that might ask people to engage while selling their information to companies that I won't name right now because you're videotaping this. But there's a whole industry around engaging patients in activities that don't necessarily have the patient's best interests in mind. But we do. And so I think that it's on us, it behooves us to meet that need and create systems, because one way or the other, they are all already living in a digital world. And so, so where's my research going with this? Well, we're thinking about large implementation. Right now, if we look at a system like Focus, there's really nothing stopping us from trying to get Focus into the hands of every single person with a serious mental illness who's getting services from community mental health centers in the state of Washington. And then if that model works, to try to have that model serve as a national model, to try to get as many helpful mobile health tools in as many hands as we possibly can. Well, there's funding and reimbursement and things like that, but on the conceptual level, we can do this. But as I'm thinking about the national deployment, I also can't help but think about low and middle income countries, right? So if you go back to the beginning of the talk, the penetration of mobile phones is not just domestic, right? We have countries that, unlike the US, that has pretty robust healthcare infrastructure. There are countries that have close to zero healthcare infrastructure. If you're thinking about the types of services that people with serious mental illness get in West Africa, oftentimes they are either non-existent or heavily abusive, rife with human rights violations, where people are chained or beaten or kept in cages outside of people's homes or in prayer camps. So in Ghana, while they might have only about 120 psychiatrists in the entire country, serving a large population of 20 million, they don't have the physical infrastructure. They might not have the clinics, but what they do have are mobile phones. For every 100 households in Ghana, there are 130 mobile phones. So we can reach them. All right, on that note, I'll end here, and I'll take some questions. Thanks for your attention, guys. Yes, sir.
Very interesting. My question is, so you're feeding them little nuggets of information based on their responses to the questions. Like, maybe their voices are wrong, and I think you said there's 190 different messages or something like that. I'm wondering if it starts to wear thin when they're getting the same messages again and again.
Yeah, so that was something that I was really concerned about in the longer term deployment, right? If you're giving someone a tool for 6 months, even though there's an internal rotation around the content so that you won't always receive exactly the same content as you did, even if you pressed on the exact same response, sooner or later you're going to run into the same stuff, right? But we didn't find that people were upset about that. In fact, we found that usually people gravitate in the first 2 weeks to 4 or 5 primary interventions that are kind of their go-to interventions. And that's what they'll use the toolkit for. They'll plug in and they'll deploy something again and again and again and again. But I do envision at some point, if we're thinking of really long-term illness management of chronic illnesses, we're going to have to somehow update the content, right? Part of it can be us, part of it might be pushing out new content once people graduate from one phase of treatment to another. But I also think that we're getting a new generation of people that are digital natives, right? And I don't think it's impossible for people to generate their own content. If we create the scaffolding for them to, let's say, create a video, inspirational image, or a personal statement that they know is going to be most potent for them before they are anxious walking into a lecture hall, for example, perhaps we can partner on populating and creating, generating new content. Throw in a potential crowdsourcing aspect to this. Well, what if we create secure communities where people might have the same diagnosis and they contribute their own content? Of course, there need to be safeguards so that people don't have videos depicting others who are unwilling to participate. But I think sustaining this and enhancing it over time can be a partnership between the researchers and the patient population. And I eventually think that that's where this is going to go.
Android is an incredibly open platform. How might you protect these users from their data getting in the wrong hands or manipulated for the wrong use?
Right. So I think that we have various data transfer. We have certain security, patient privacy and security measures that we do to try to encrypt data in the transmission pipeline. But you're right, part of the advantages of Android, the reason that we do it is because it's incredibly open, right? It allows us to tinker in a way that we can't do with iOS. I think that ultimately, when it comes to deploying this in real-world clinics, right, and doing this as part of regular care and make them broadly available, there is the potential of folks trying to have some sort of nefarious use of patient data. And then I think, on the one hand, we can keep trying to enhance the data transmission, but as we know from every industry right now, if hackers get it into their mind that they want to bust a system, usually they will, in one form or another. And so I think that the solution to this, to some extent, is very knowledgeable and informed consent, so that people are aware not only of what are the risks that we know exist in the intervention right now, but here's some of the risks that we don't know. That it's possible that someone might grab information and redirect it, that it's possible that someone might repurpose this. To contextualize, again, it's possible just like any other thing that you're doing on your Android device, or just like any other thing that you're doing with your online banking, or all these other resources that we know that have been hacked before. And so there we essentially provide we don't infantilize the patient, and we say, these are the risks, just like any other digital environment that you live in or want to engage in, and you are informed and make the decision on your own whether it's worth your time or not. What we find in our studies is that the researchers and the IRB at our institutions are typically much more concerned about this than patients. And in fact, in the same way that people will go through that user agreement and the longer your consent form is, the greater the likelihood that people won't read it, right? And so people, in the same way that they go through a licensing agreement and just want to go, let me go down there and I'll click it because I want iTunes, we try to stop them and say, no, let's really discuss all the risks and everything. And again, I don't know that it's all that different from any other resource that people are using out there right now. So it certainly has its new risks, but also all these new opportunities. Follow-up question? Yeah. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So not only is there data vulnerability in this, but there's also user vulnerability, right? So what we have a protocol where we try to get, again, when we give someone a phone, they can undo this all in a second if they want to. But usually we'll try to lock their screen if it's not used for 2 minutes or more. We try to create passwords. We try to give them protocols for how not to leave it in open spaces to make sure that family members don't see it unintentionally. We've been thinking more and more about trying to deploy interventions among adolescents. And so there's this whole risk of people really being bullying or doing all kinds of things if they have access to information, if they inadvertently saw that someone is receiving psychotherapy content on their device, how that can be really misused. So we try to have behavioral protocols like that. We also try to ensure that people never use the device while they're driving. I mean, there are all these risks that are not only associated with our intervention, but really with just use of any mobile device that we try to put in place. But once they're out of the lab, they're out in the wild, right? And so we try to inform people, but ultimately they do what they do. Yeah.
So with the Focus and the CrossCheck apps, are you eventually planning to have those be like publicly available or exclusively tied into like mental health care provider care as a part of programs?
Yeah, from my perspective, that's both publicly available because they're leaving the research domain. And ultimately, yes, definitely, I'm a very applied researcher. So if we only do this as an intellectual exercise affecting the lives of 100 or 300 or 1,000 people, that's a lot of time and effort and money to have such little impact. So definitely our intention is to do that. And I have licensing agreements with various digital health companies to try to do this. If you have any ideas of how we can get it out there into the real world, I'm certainly open to hearing this. Whether it's made public, meaning direct to user, that we make it available on Google Play, or there actually is an iPhone version of it now as well, so whether we make it available on iTunes or Google Play or not, we haven't decided yet. I mean, I think that there's certainly opportunities with that. There are also the risks. And if we do that, it would have to be as a service or as a model that is separate from the university. Because if I provide this to participants, I could never do this without the appropriate follow-up to make sure that people have technical problems resolved, that if there's a clinical crisis, that we don't do something about it. Again, once you post it out there, downloads start and it's out of your control. So we would just need to be very thoughtful about what might be the risks about that. But ultimately, absolutely, that's the intention, is to make it broadly available. Whether it's through healthcare systems or clinicians or direct to user, we don't know yet. We don't know what the implications really would be about that. The implementation study that I described about trying to do this in Washington, that'll be helpful because there we are definitely leaving the university healthcare system and deploying it out into the real world. And we're collecting data and providing clinical supervision, but it's out there. And so we'll see how that works.
Very interesting talk.
Thanks.
You hear me? So I have a question. It seems like in terms of the applied aspects of the interventions, there is definitely benefits. The question is more related to the use of science-based clinical interventions as the source of your program, because what you want to show is that data and theories developed in clinical research can be applied using these mobile devices. And I don't know, I haven't heard, I mean, you had a comparison, for example, with the Focus, I think, to another group-related therapy. But what about the other side, that is comparing it to a control group? So how much we know that everything that you show is not related to more basic human needs that are not directly related to science-based clinical interventions? For example, immediacy. They get immediate response. They don't have to wait 3 weeks until the clinicians or the psychiatrists see them. Personal attention, another aspect. Listening to you, somebody just in a sense. And I wonder whether you try to look at that, for example, and again, there might be some ethical issues, but providing them non-diagnostic information and see whether it still helps them just because the other aspects that are related, again, to more human-to-human interaction.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question, and I think that there are several layers to that. Not only are there these paratherapeutic elements that are happening here, but there's now also access to a mobile device, right? What about the fact that now they can also watch videos? And in fact, part of what we do is we train people at baseline to use everything of the mobile phone as much as they want to learn. In fact, we've had a participant that we've trained how to access pornography using a smartphone, because it's not our role to judge what they use the smartphone for, and it's part of the package. And if that's what you want to use it for, we'll train you how to do it. Well, not do all of it, right? But how to do aspects of it, how to reach the content that you're interested in reaching. And so I think it's a very good question. I think that potentially there could be experimental designs that would control for that. And in fact, the one thing that we have done specifically is to see whether the content delivery modality makes a difference. So we wanted people to rate the difference between the video version of it versus the written delivery of it. And we found superiority to the modality, to the video modality, outside of situations where people were in public spaces, where they almost always opted to reading it rather than hearing and seeing it. Does it really need to be linked to evidence-based therapeutic models or not, or whether there's something, that's a question that I think is relevant to psychotherapy across the board, right? I don't think that that's just a narrow statement about it. Is the fact that someone is is it the content of a CBT intervention for anxiety that's potent, or is it the fact that you're stopping work or getting on a bus and coming to a clinic, sitting in a waiting room, introspecting, perhaps talking to your partner or your family members after the event, or is it the specific framework that was deployed that is causing what it's causing? That's a good question that I don't have an answer to. But from my perspective, again, as a pragmatist and a person who's focused on application, I naturally drew from my training. I'm trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist with an emphasis on psychosocial interventions for serious mental illness. And so naturally I gravitated towards grabbing things that I know have worked for me in a clinical setting and use those. Really we're using very adapted versions of them, right? Because everything needs to be about a minute or shorter. So we tried to think, how do we distill this to what I think is the most relevant nugget of a 15-minute or 20-minute interaction? What is the crux of this? And try to deliver that in a way that we think could be digestible using a mobile platform. But whether it's that, or some things like they commented when we did the comparison of the videos, that they liked the calm voice of the presenters, or the clinical demeanor. There's several, I'm one of the therapists depicted in this, but there's several others. The fact that there was something soothing about someone talking to them in a calm, controlled manner, maybe that's it. I don't know.
Hi, I'm not a clinician. I'm a professor of women's and gender studies here. My name's Julie Ellman, and I focus on disability studies. I was curious, I have two separate questions that kind of are entwined around the same issue, but I was wondering how a lot of times app design and technology is imagined to be a sort of identity neutral thing, right, or an apolitical thing. I'm wondering how other demographic factors like race, class, gender, sexuality impact, if they impact the design of systems like CrossCheck and the other, I forget the name of the, Focus, thank you, the other app that you described. So that was one question, how do you deal with sort of cultural competency type issues in the sort of digital realm?
Uh-huh.
And then the second question was I wanted to hear more about the involuntary monitoring. Because I was thinking in relation to this race, class, gender, and sexuality, there have been certain populations, right, who have been more, have been involuntarily surveilled more so than folks who can volunteer to, log their stuff in a Fitbit or other types of, I know this isn't a Fitbit, but other types of voluntary surveillance. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more. You said that you weren't listening to their conversations, but I kind of wanted to hear a little bit more about what types of things you you're listening to quantity of speech. Is that
Right.
you
So
know,
we're
okay.
looking. So one, there is no involuntary. I mean, I know if you're thinking about what might be the involuntary monitoring consequences of deploying systems like this broadly, and I can tell you that those are sitting in your pocket or probably your purse right now. So whether, so data is being collected and culled all the time by your mobile carriers in one form or another, and it's processed and sort of de-identified, and there are various procedures for that. But the technology and the ongoing data collection, think about every time that you use Google Maps, you need to authorize the location. Well, you're getting a ping, right? You're generating the same data that will later on help Google Maps determine what is the best route to drive home. That's how they determine that, your user data, right? And so that monitoring, I don't know that it's involuntary, perhaps it's not a conscious decision that you're making every time that you access Google Maps to say, yeah, I want to give you information so that you can help people with their driving route, or to have data collected about a particular user. In terms of what we're collecting, we describe everything in as much detail as we can. We sometimes show graphs of the type of data that we're collecting, and we specifically emphasize that part about conversation, saying you could be talking to a drug dealer and we would never know. We don't know the content of the conversation, and we can't determine the identity or the gender of the speaker. So the only thing that we look at are you in an environment, we don't even know if it's you speaking, right? We know that you're in an environment where a conversation is taking place, usually between 6 and 12 feet from your device. And that's what we're thinking of as a social environment. And once that's happening, we know how long those conversations, if they're close enough to be picked up by the microphone, how those conversations are linked to that user over a particular time frame. That's about it. In terms of the involuntary piece, we try to be as transparent. There's no advantage from our perspective to do anything in a clandestine manner. The other part is how do cultural and gender and sort of potential target population variables play into this. So I usually try to get my end user into the lab to help inform the system. And so when we developed Focus originally, it was intended for deployment with this large psychiatric rehabilitation agency that was working in Chicago, and that's where we drew our sample from. And so we had a representation, both in terms of gender and ethnicity, that was identical or close to identical to who we know they serve. Now, how generalizable is that? That's, I think that's debatable. It probably isn't. And not only are there elements that are linked to the individual, but perhaps the urban versus more rural setting that might impact it. And I'll go even a step further. Why is it just in English? Right? I mean, I think that there are other aspects. So certainly we can continue to enhance and improve the potency and the targeted nature of this. It depends on the user needs, right? I mean, at some point, I imagine, we're really debating right now whether Focus, before this VA deployment, whether Focus, the way that it's worded right now and the visuals that are there, whether they're right for a veteran population. I think they might not be. I think that perhaps having someone in uniform speaking, or maybe not, or maybe having someone who looks anything but someone from the military is the right person to engage that population. So we have limited time and resources, and so we try to create things that would be as engaging and as potent to the target population as we can, but it's always certainly going to be flawed. Yeah. I think we might have time for one more question. Tim?
Yeah. So it was nice to hear that you got feedback, like we've gotten feedback from patients that say they actually like this, and it's like people usually don't ask them about what their daily life is like. They have sort of infrequent contact with therapists and so forth. What we've run into, and I just wanted to hear your thoughts, it's like you don't have to convince the patients about it, and we're getting this information, but even at the assessment level, it's the clinicians that just don't buy into this. That to them, it's like, I don't have time to get this stream of data and all this other stuff, and it's like, it's very hard, even when you show that, there's some incremental kind of validity to this beyond what you could get just by asking people what their week was like. There's this resistance, and I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, that's very consistent with our experience. I don't know. So whenever I call something resistance, I try to first see whether I'm the problem. You know, and in a way I am, right? Because I'm not considering. So let's say with CrossCheck, we were thinking instead of us looking in the background, hovering in the background, why not have clinicians log onto the dashboard, see the data for themselves, and they can make their own decisions when to access this or not. And so we met with psychiatry residents who are going to be the primary provider for these folks right then and there. When we came in with the CS team, like computer science collaborators, came in with multiple displays of how we can graph this and show this. And the moment we saw their responses, we realized this is not going to fly. So first of all, graphs, forget it. Nobody reads graphs or understands graphs outside, unless they're working with them on a regular basis. If they haven't seen this in the last year or so, nobody knows what a Y or an X or a color is, and nobody has the time to look at it. And they've got 15 minutes with back-to-back patients throughout the day. They're not going to, unless there's something that we can say, we will dramatically improve what you're doing by doing this, they're not going to do this. And then we thought, okay, so visual displays are not the way to go. What if we what if we write things for you? And the thing that seemed to be the most potent form of feedback was, call Bill today. So I don't want to know what your algorithms are or your weighting systems are or how this looks in relation to where this person was a month ago. I'm busy. I got things to do. Tell me what to do. Tell me what you need done, and I'll just do that. And you know, that's a practical solution. I think that's right. And then we learned, okay, well, clearly we need to remove that particular decision-making source from the mix here because it's not realistic. They're not going to do it. But when we do reach out to them, after we do make that call and show that a person does in fact endorse problems, and we call them, we say, we spoke to Bill, he's not doing well, give him a call, that does work. They will often act on that. Thanks, guys. I appreciate your attention.